Cool. Good afternoon, BSides Belfast. How's everyone doing?
Good.
Good?
Yeah.
Excellent, cool. So apologies for the clickbait title, first of all. I needed to have something to fill up the room. It looks like a few of you have borne the bait. But I'm going to switch things up from a lot of the talks we've heard today and speak a bit less technically about cybersecurity and a bit more about some of the natural human biases that go into some of the poor decisions we make and more broadly consumers make when it comes to security. Put simply, why we can make stupid decisions. So I'm only going to show you an introduction to the whole field of what is deemed behavioral economics, but it should give you a good platform to start understanding why some of the most common things that are often in the news are seen and observed in the wild. So a bit about me. So first of all, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an economist, I don't have any formal training in the field. However, I have built and worked for various companies in roles where I've built products, and in that time I've had lots of failures, lots of products that haven't worked or have had big gaping security flaws, but also a few that have been pretty successful as well. And I currently work for a company called Anomaly, which deals in threat intelligence, and we're currently hiring at the moment if anyone is interested. But I'm not going to speak too much about the product pitch. Now, before we begin, what we're going to cover today is lots of academic experiments, and you're probably going to go away with a feeling of wanting to test everything, so wondering why you're making the decision, why you chose to buy a certain drink, why you chose to come here today. But hopefully you'll come away shaping those decisions to positively influence your own behaviors and those of others in the future when it comes to cybersecurity. Now, a lot of what I talk about today involves academic studies, so I give you the warning up front. A lot of these studies are unethical for some part, so don't necessarily replicate them in your everyday work, but it's academic research, so they're allowed to be unethical, right? And I'm going to ask a few people to volunteer. So if you don't want to volunteer, just don't volunteer. And if I pick you out of the audience, I'm looking at a few people I know, don't feel you need to answer a question. So there's a lot of fields that have started to study the way in which we make decisions. So there's a field of consumer psychology, behavioral economics, social psychology are just a few, right? And their aim is to try and understand why we act the way we do. And the interest in the fields are increasing over time. So either we're becoming more irrational, or people are realizing that we have inherent cognitive weaknesses in our decision-making abilities. More and more people like me are jumping on the bandwagon, right? And that in itself is a bias, right? There's something called the bandwagon effect, where people will follow a crowd. People will do what a crowd are doing simply because a crowd is doing it, right? And there's two key concepts as we go through that I want to touch, and they might be new to you, they might not be. But the first being a heuristic. So these are really important, and we use these almost every single second of the day. There's mental shortcuts that help us make decisions quickly. So when we open up the fridge and we see a bit of rotting food, we don't need to spend 10 minutes figuring out why it's rotting or whether we should eat it. We just don't eat it because we instinctively know it's probably going to make us ill. But it happens with all types of things. So there's one heuristic, the availability heuristic, which essentially means we heavily weight the first piece of information that comes to mind when we make a decision, right? So if we've been primed with something and it comes to our memory, we're probably going to use that heavily in whatever we choose to do. So for example, if I've read a lot of business studies on starting a successful business, I might have read Steve Jobs' biography, I might have done some reading up on Bill Gates, I might remember all the successes those guys have had, And because that comes to my mind first, I might think it's easy to start a business, or I might think I'm pretty successful at starting a business. And this happens a lot with restaurants, right? So there's a stat out there that 90% of restaurants in New York City will fail every single year. Yet every other chef wants to open a restaurant in New York City, right? It's their dream. And they think they'll be different to the rest because they've got something different and because they think they've learned a bit more. And that information that they've been researching and learning comes to their mind first over all the other failures and the errors that other people have had and seen in the past, which have caused their businesses to shut down. And that falls into what we would deem cognitive biases in behavioral economics or consumer psychology, right? So when a heuristic, that ability to make a decision quickly, fails us and leads us to draw an incorrect conclusion from what's in front of us, it forms a cognitive bias. And we all suffer them, right? They're little quirks that make us human, and we're all susceptible to them. In fact, they're pretty useful, and they're probably one of the reasons why you're here listening to either this talk today or just at BSides in general, right? We're going to talk about something called the confirmation bias, which essentially means that we seek information or seek opinions that match our own, right? So we come to conferences, we come to talks based on information that we're interested in or know something about. We don't necessarily come to talks that challenge our own beliefs or are different to what we believe in, right? And because of the natural human tendencies we suffer, a lot of people fall victim to them in a security context, right? So when we're talking technically about security, we talk about probabilities, right? We talk about mathematics, right? If I do something, how much better is it going to be than doing something else? What is the risk of change? And we look at this very, very closely, and we might have automated code reviews, right, which tell us where we need to fix things and where we don't. It's either, it's a binary option. It's either we do something or we don't do something. But security is also about feelings, right? We don't necessarily act always rationally when it comes to security. So I went on holiday recently, and it was in the middle of nowhere. We booked a cottage up in Scotland. And there was no one about for miles and miles, yet every single day we locked the front door. There was no one that was going to burgle us, right? We're used to doing it. I live in London, right? So we're used to locking the door, but yet we still did it, even though there was no need to, right? We're just not very good at judging the probabilities of risk. And this is really, really key to security, right? So we hear all the time in the news about security incidents happening, and the whole security teams will start to focus on these things, right? And this is because it's right at the front of our mind. It's a new risk, and we want to take it on board. Now, some risks will exaggerate, like those that have just been in the news. Others will tend to downplay, right? So imagine you're standing there and you're being offered 2 glasses of clear liquid, and one of those glasses is being offered by a chemical company, and one is being offered by the Queen, right? Which one of those 2 do you think you would choose? You might not choose either of them, right? But ultimately, you're probably not going to go with that chemical company, right? Because you might inherently think that there's something bad in the water, right? And the fact is, it might just be water. Another good example is, do you feel safer driving, or do you feel safer being driven, right? There's an element of control. If we feel in control, then we don't feel as scared of the risk of crashing. Whereas if your partner or your friend is driving, you might have that uncontrolled element, and you may judge the risk of crashing to be a little bit higher. And it happens again with all types of things. So now that you've been primed with how we consider risks and how we judge risks, I'm going to talk about 4 biases. So those cognitive biases we touched on at the start, and how they actually fit into a cybersecurity context. So the first mental shortcoming we're going to look at is the confirmation bias. So we've talked a bit about this, but essentially we seek out information that conforms to our beliefs, right? And it happens with news stories, it happens with politics, it happens with the friendship groups we choose to associate it with. So I'm going to do a bit of audience participation, and if anyone wants to volunteer for a quick little experiment, it would be much appreciated. No? No takers. Okay, we can go ahead without doing that. So a sequence of numbers here, right? 2, 4, 6. Can anyone guess the next number? In fact, let's do it a bit differently, right? So looking at those sequences of numbers, I will give you the opportunity to shout out what you think are the next 3 numbers in that sequence. And I will simply tell you whether it conforms to the rule that I have written down here on the slide deck, or whether it doesn't conform to the rule. And then when someone thinks they're confident with what the rule is, then they can shout it out. Or if no one shouts out, I can just tell you what the rule is, and we can skip this entirely. So does anyone want to have a guess as to what the next 3 numbers are in that sequence?
10.
So a sequence of 3 numbers. So 10, 16. Yep, they conform to the rule. Any other guesses?
10, 12.
Yep, conforms to the rule. Can anyone guess what the rule is from that?
Is it just the numbers are greater as you go along? It's just they're always bigger?
Yeah, exactly that. So the rule is that the numbers must be in ascending order, right? So any combination of numbers, 5, 10, 500, 1, 7, 9, all in ascending order. Anything in descending order wouldn't have mapped to the rule, right? So that was a good guess. And actually, it bucks the trend of an experiment that was actually done considering that exact scenario, right? So participants were given the opportunity to submit the next 3 sequences of numbers and submit as many consecutive 3 sequences of numbers as they wanted before they were confident that they knew the rule, right? And when they were confident that they knew the rule, they gave it to the researcher, who would either tell them they were right or wrong, similar to what we've just done. Now, a lot of people followed what we would call positive test patterns. So one of the sequences I think shouted out was 8, 10, 12, right? So in that case, you might think the rule is increasing intervals of 2 or plus 2 every time. Or another group, so one of the most common answers that the researcher saw was multiples of the first number. So you would essentially times the first number by a value to get the next number. What the researchers saw is almost all the participants tried the rule that they had in their mind each time when they submitted a number. So that is, if they thought it was increasing intervals of 2, they would submit 6, 8, 10, then 12, 14, 16. They didn't try a negative test strategy whereby they went against what they thought the rule was, right? So instead of saying 6, 8, 10, they might have said something that they didn't think conformed to the rule, which might have been 10, 8, 6. And if they would have done that, they would have got the correct rule. And you can see in the chart there, right, so what the incorrect, the 75% on that chart is pointing to is that on the first instance when someone called out what they thought the rule was, they were incorrect because they were positively testing what they believed to be the correct rule. They were conforming to their own beliefs and they thought they were right, when in fact if they would have just done a simple test to try and challenge their beliefs, they would have realized that their positive strategy wasn't a very good one. And this happens in mainstream media, right? So I'm not going to get political, but when we start hearing news stories about Donald Trump, you get 2 sides. You get the right wing and the left wing. And everyone says, oh, everyone on the right wing, they just listen to Fox News, they're wrong. And then everyone on the left wing says, oh, we listen to whatever, NBC, the BBC, we must be right, right? Ultimately, these people are going to news sources that they trust, that deliver information that conforms to their beliefs, right? That's the reason why they're going to those sites. In 2008, during the election where Obama was running, the group of researchers looked at Amazon book trends, right? So what people had on their Amazon wish lists. And they found that people who supported Obama were looking at books that painted Obama in a good light, whereas those who didn't support him were actually putting books on their wish list where Obama was in a negative light. They weren't buying the books for the information, they were buying the books for the confirmation, right? And another experiment done, so this is one where people were looking at support for various issues like gun ownership or abortion, so pretty strong moral issues. And what happened was they were shown a variety of news articles, so 4 news articles in total, 2 supporting their beliefs, 2 opposing their beliefs. And what the researchers found was participants spent 36% longer looking at articles that conformed to their beliefs, so supported what they already knew, than those that challenged their own beliefs. Now this is really important, right, because we all have very strong views about what we're doing, whether it be in a security context or a wider general everyday context, right? We do this because we don't like to be proved wrong. We like positive test strategies because it doesn't make us look silly or stupid, right? If we can tell ourselves we're doing it right, it feels good. And it's dangerous because even in examples where data is used to validate arguments, even quantitative measures can be proved wrong, right? And what people will do is they will read charts how they want to read them, and not necessarily pick up the chart the way it should be read. And you see this a lot in journalism, actually, the way various journalists will build graphs that don't quite look right or are shifted towards looking to support the view in which they want to share with the audience. And this is why, especially from an analyst point of view, you want to try and prove yourself wrong during investigations, right? Just because you think you're right, first of all, doesn't necessarily mean you're right. Right? Can you get a colleague to challenge your views? Or when hiring, can you build a team that doesn't necessarily say yes to everything you're doing, that comes on board and actually challenges what you think is right, whether that's right or wrong? And look beyond the usual sources, right? So again, if you're just looking, going back to the news example, at sources of information, of learning that is potentially biased, again, you may be missing a whole host of things which are proving your current beliefs wrong. So now we'll look at the future. So we'll look at our inherent optimism. So we always think the future is going to be good, right? We think we're going to get better jobs as we grow older. We think we're going to have more money. We think our kids are going to grow up to be successful. There's not many people that have kids and think they're not going to do very well, or they're going to live bad lives, or they're going to get ill as they grow up, right? When the reality is that those things might, and they have a very good chance of happening. I mean, who thinks they'll come to BSides and be worse off after the experience, right? You think you're going to come here to learn, and you probably will, but equally something particularly bad might happen to you whilst you're here. And I'm going to be a bit morbid, again, talking about the health situation, because it is a big one, and a lot of health bodies struggle with it in trying to educate people towards healthy eating or living better lifestyles. So 50%, so one side of this room, and I'm not pointing to the left side necessarily here, are probably going to get cancer during their lives, right? And that's pretty high. But most people you ask probably don't have cancer on their radar, or aren't preparing for it, which is fine. It's not something you should be preparing for. But it's interesting when you start looking at it in how stubborn or how it can influence the way we actually look at things. So here's an experiment. Another experiment that was run. So there was a particular type of cancer, and I forget exactly what type of cancer it was, but people were asked to predict their likelihood of getting it. They weren't medical health experts, they were just regular guys with no particular medical training. And there's 2 participants here, but this is representative of a much wider study. Participant A on the left, their first estimation of getting cancer was 40%. So pretty low optimism for their own lives. They were pretty ranking their chance of getting cancer highly. The other person, so participant B in this example, thought he was much more robust, much stronger. That chance of getting cancer was just 10%, right? Which, as we've already seen, is way below what the reality is. Now, this particular type of cancer in the type of person they were using for the study, the actual likelihood of them getting it was 30%. So 3 in 10 people were likely to get cancer. And they were told this once they submitted their original estimation. And then they were asked again, so what are your chances of getting this particular cancer, right? So you think, having just been told your actual probability of getting cancer, you would probably line it up to that base estimate, or at least put it pretty close. Participant A did exactly that, right? So their second estimation, they said, okay, yeah, 30%, okay, that's fine. It's a bit better than what I estimated. They've got a better chance of longevity. I now estimate it to be 31%. Participant B was a lot more stubborn, right? Having been told his chances were 30%, he thought he was a bit more likely to get cancer, but only 4% more, right? He was really stubborn in changing his belief, and he was still thinking, yeah, it's probably not going to happen to me in my lifetime, even though all the research would suggest otherwise. And as I say, that's widely represented across a study of 1,000 people, right? And these are the similar results to what we are seeing across that whole experiment. And here's another good example, and it's not necessarily the best example in a group of security-focused people. However, when you ask the general public what their own risk of being phished or what their own risk of falling victim to a hack is, they often will tell you it's pretty low, right? They'll tell you, oh, I have pretty good internet security practices, or I don't go to sites that are potentially going to affect me or vulnerable. I just look at Google and the news and browse Facebook, right? That's all I do on the internet. But then they might have a friend who's very similar in their social situation, but they'll say, yeah, if you look at John, he's probably going to get phished. He's probably going to click some silly link on Facebook and get hacked, or he's going to give his bank details over the phone when someone calls him up, right? Even though their lives are pretty similar. And again, that sort of outcome has been represented in a number of studies. So one on online privacy in this example, right? Essentially, participants were given a list of questions about online privacy and security and what they thought, and they were asked to rank these various behaviors on a 1 to 7 ranking. So 1, I'm not going to fall victim to it, to 7, I'm probably going to fall victim to it, right? And when they looked at, during the experiment, they had to rank their own risk as well as a peer risk, and the peer was someone very close to their own social standing and their own employment, right? It was almost a mirror image they were asked to imagine. And you can see here, right, the self-risk, so the actual risk of falling victim to any of those privacy problems was lower than that they believed of their peer. So they were optimistic about themselves, but actually we've got an optimism bias for our own situation, but we're not so optimistic for others, as that study shows there. And this is something that can be avoided quite easily, right? People have a sense of invincibility. And as I say, people always think the future for themselves is going to be better. We have a desired end positive state, not a negative state. And one of the reasons for that is we have more information about ourselves, right? We know our own preferences, we know our own behaviors. We don't necessarily know our next door neighbor's preferences as well, even our best friends. So we need to take away that feeling of invincibility. We need to introduce negative events and the consequences of negative events. And a lot of companies do this at the moment, right? So what they do is they want to make bad events more retrievable from someone's mind. So instead of them being overly optimistic, you bring them back down to earth, right? So Facebook's a good example. As you click a link moving away from the site, it might be a completely genuine link, but there's a second step there that says, are you sure you want to move away? Have you considered the risks of going to a third-party site, right? Even that's not perfect because a lot of people are going to ignore it, But it's that extra step that's making people think, well, should I be so positive about where I'm going next? Do I need to think about it twice? And you really want to highlight the losses that may occur from someone doing a bad thing, right? Or someone doing a bad event that they don't necessarily know will be a bad event, such as navigating away from a secure environment. So phishing emails are a really good example in that instance. But another really interesting one, actually, is in Germany. So what they have in Germany is something called piss screens. So they have these in bars and clubs. And when you go drinking, and after maybe 3 or 4 beers, or half a beer if you're me, you need to go to the toilet, there's a little screen in front of the urinal. So this is for men, or I think it's only for men. I don't know if there's a women's one. But the men will stand there and a little game will appear on the screen. And essentially they've got to control a little car around the track whilst they're pissing, right? And it'll actually monitor the speed at which they're reacting to turning the car on the track to avoid the obstacles. And if their reactions are slow, which is obviously an indication that they might be drunk, at the end of the game it'll flash up with the number for the local taxi firm or Uber or whoever to say, we think you're a little bit drunk, do you want to get a taxi instead of driving? And the drink drive rates plummeted after that campaign, right? Just by bringing that negative event of getting in your car and driving and potentially crashing, which would happen on the game if they were perceived to be drunk, to their mind, so that they then didn't go and engage in that action going forward. So we've looked at the past, we've looked at the future, let's look at the present. And how much we love the current state of affairs, how much we love to do the same things over and over, that it causes us to miss great opportunities and, in a cybersecurity sense, stick with negative outcomes. So just have a think about some of these things here, right? So how many times do you change your utilities provider? Or how many times do you change your I don't know, favorite brand of cereal or toothpaste or cosmetic product? It's very likely once you've found something good or something you believe is pretty good for your situation, you're not going to change. And again, this isn't always a bad thing. If you've got a favorite brand of toothpaste and it's cleaning your teeth, what's the point of changing, right? But in some situations, the status quo is not always the best option. So there's a really interesting story from some of the research that I was looking at for this presentation, right? And one of the things that got the researchers looking at the status quo bias is they had a colleague, and for, I think it was 5 or 6 years, this colleague had brought in the same lunch every single day to work, right? It was a ham and cheese sandwich. And then there was a particular day, it was a Thursday, they remember it perfectly, and I've got the date here, March 3rd, 1968 was when the research was conducted. And he changed to a chicken salad sandwich on that day. And then for the next 5 and 6 years, he had that exact same lunch, right? He just stuck with the status quo. He didn't want to change, even though there was plenty of great lunch options out there. And again, another experiment looking at the status quo, right? A group of participants were told that they were putting themselves down for a brand new car. So they had found a new car at a dealership that they really liked. And they were told there was none currently in stock, but they had an option between 4 colors. So they could choose any of the 4 colors. Now, a week before they went to pick the car up, they were then told 3 various situations. So the groups were essentially split into 3 groups. So a week before, they were called again and said by the dealership, you can have any car color you want. What color do you want? Do you want the red one? Do you want the blue one? Do you want the white one? Or do you want the green one? In that case, 22% opted for the red car. Now, the next group, so they were first told when they got that phone call, actually, we've only got the red car available. Do you want it? And they said, yeah, we'll have any car. We wanted any car color, that's fine. And then they got to the dealership, and actually every car was available. And the dealership said, do you want to change your mind? Well, actually, Most of them didn't want to change their mind. 53% stuck with the red car. So way above the 22%, right, that we would expect. And the same thing happened, but the other way around. So they were offered the blue, white, or tan one, not green one, sorry. And the ones who selected that when they got the first phone call because the red car wasn't available, again, decided to stick with that decision. This time only 15% went with the red car when they were given the opportunity, when it became available at the dealership. So moving this into sort of real life situations, this has big impacts, right? So the organ donation rate in Austria is 99%. In Denmark, it's 4%. Does anyone know the reason why? Exactly, right? So just by making it a physical opt-out where a person's got to say, look, I don't want to donate my organs, they rarely ever do that. 1% of the people do it, right? Whereas 4% will actually decide in Denmark to opt in to donate organs. And for anyone wondering, in Scotland and Wales, it's opt-out. In England and Northern Ireland, it's opt-in. And I'm not sure of the exact rates, but you can be pretty sure they're probably quite similar to that. And this is pretty important when we start talking about privacy in some respects. Because for a long time, companies could just opt you into things, or they would have a default opt-in button checked when you signed up for a product or service, right? And then you get a ton of emails or letters through the post saying you've opted in because you didn't see the little checkbox hidden right at the corner of the page that says, yes, I agree to consent. The EU has kind of brought in a load of laws against that, but it still exists in some places. And the reason why we do this is because of the fear of unknown and anticipated regret, right? We know now is stable, we know now is good. Even if we're offered a 1% increase in security, or let's say a 5% increase in security, there's a lot of risks associated with that, whether that be choosing a new bit of software or choosing a new way to do things, right? Because it could go wrong, it might take more effort, right? There's a whole host of things in that process that might not keep things going as well as they are, even though they're probably pretty low in reality. So you really got to set the status quo in people's minds to get them to start thinking about changing their behavior. So that might be, and I've seen a lot of companies now doing what they call security reviews or benchmarking, right? Letting people know where they fit in the wider world. So you are better than 99% of companies, or you are worse than 99% of companies, right? And when someone hears such big changes or sees they're so far away from the status quo, it gives them the incentive to change. You need to make the fear of staying the same higher than the fear of change, right? So you need to make it more compelling for them to change their current behaviors. And Toyota's a good example. Toyota and Tesla are good examples of this actually when it comes to electric cars. So instead of Toyota going all out with electric, they kind of went with hybrid and electric for a while. And I think they still make the Priuses, right? Which was a hugely successful car at the time. Because people knew petrol cars, they wanted to stick with the status quo of petrol, but they also liked the green credentials of the Prius. So it was a nice, easy shift into the electric or green market, if you will. Whereas Tesla said, we're just not going to have petrol engines, right? We're going to go all in on electric. And while they're starting to see a change now as electric becomes a status quo, it's taken them a long time to get there, right? So Tesla are, a 15-year-old company now or something like that, and they're now starting to see good market traction. But even now, it's still tough. So finally, I've got 5 minutes for this, but it's fine, we've got enough time. So we're looking at anchoring, right? So I'm going to talk about why we're really lazy when we make decisions and rely way too much on the first bit of information that we're told. Right? So I'm not going to invite anyone to stage because I don't think anyone would nominate themselves. But if you have a think in your head what the answer to this question is. Anyone know the answer? Anyone want to shout out an answer?
Like 100,000.
100,000. Close. The answer is 40,320, right? Not many people can do a math question like that very quickly unless they've been pre-warned that it's coming. But an experiment was done with two similar questions. One where the numbers were descending, one where the numbers were ascending, right? And these were two different groups, and they were asked to predict the answer, sorry. Group 1, where the numbers were descending, so 87654, predicted the answer to be 2,250. Whereas ascending, they predicted it to be 512, so it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The reason for the difference? Well, think about how we read the question. We read it from left to right. So what the participants were doing, we were reading 876, producing the answer to that, and then trying to figure out what the final answer might be based on that first bit of information. The other group were doing it the other way, 1, 2, 3. Okay, this is a lower number, I'm now going to predict the answer from that, and as such they come up with a way lower example. Social security numbers. So again, I was just doing a Google image search to look for something good on this slide, and it comes up with way too many people who have posted it on Twitter. But an interesting auction was done around social security numbers, right? So students were shown a list of items that they were asked to bid on in auction. But before they bid on the items, they were asked to write the last 2 digits of their social security number next to each one of the items. So if the last digits of my social security number were 11, I would write down $11, so as a price next to each one of those items. They were then asked to bid on the actual items, so an auction was then held, and they were allowed to bid whatever they wanted for the items. Now this is insane, right, if you look at this. So people on the top there, that's the last 2 digits of their social security numbers. People who had lower social security numbers bid significantly less than those who had higher social security numbers, right? It was, in some cases, 346% higher. Now that doesn't happen in everyday auctions, and that type of example is pretty far-fetched. But it highlights the process of anchoring. They had taken that first number, that first price they had written on the page, and they had then anchored it to their next decision, right? So they had moved away from their anchor to decide what they were going to bid for the item, right? So they said $11, I can go a bit higher, and I'm only going to go X amount higher. It happens when we buy a car, right? We know the price, we're going to haggle based on the initial price we're told. We're not going to come in with something way lower, or if we do, we're probably going to be rebuffed pretty quickly as it being a stupid offer. And it happens again in security with loads of different things. But passwords are a great example when you sign up for services and it says your password must be 12 characters. Or it says your password must have 10 digits, 2 numbers, whatever, right? What you really want to be doing in these situations to influence behavior change is really start to influence by anchor, right? So you can see the top example, a good password is 12 characters. I set the anchor 12 characters, sorry. Whereas if you say your password must be between 6 and 20 characters, I have no real anchor to go on, so I'm probably just going to choose the lowest number. I'm going to go with 6 characters, just because it's, again, the easiest. There's no idea of, in this case, a status quo, but also an anchor. And again, we see this across loads of different things, and it happens in all types of marketing. So it's all about improving behavior change. Cool, so that about wraps it up actually quite nicely. There's hundreds of cognitive biases that we fall victim to, right? And it happens across all types of things. And security could really do with investigating the field a lot more, in my opinion. And especially in my role as building cybersecurity products, I think there's a lot of ways in which we can positively influence people to change their behaviors rather than build products that force them to change their behaviors. And this was really aimed to be a primer so you can start to understand how we're predictably irrational, but how you can use those predictabilities in our natural behavior to actually take control, right? And even in that, so I show you a big list like that, there's biases that result, and I was a bit nervous of showing that. So there's something called the choice paradox, where if you offer someone too much choice, they just simply are paralyzed and they won't take action. So by showing you a list of hundreds of biases, you might just think, well, there's too many out there, I'm not going to do anything, right? So I've kind of cut the list down, so hopefully you can go on Wikipedia and start having a look. But there's tons of information online that distills this information down and gives you great sources to start looking at security investigations. And there's tons of books out there as well. But as I say, this is only aimed to be a primer today and just to get you a feeling of some of the ways we can be inherently stupid, but also how we can use that stupidity to make positive changes in our lives, specifically around cybersecurity. Thank you very much.